Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our weekly pay entry webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started today. Please don't forget that these webinars are intended for educational purposes only. And while we hope that you do learn new information, the trainers that present these webinars are not attorneys. Therefore, all information provided during the presentation and the Q&A session should not be construed, as legal advice. All right, well, with that out of the way, welcome everyone. Today we are going to be talking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Just as a reminder, if you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the question box and they will be addressed during the Q&A session. We've actually gotten a lot of requests for this topic, just given everything kind of going on in the world and employers trying to navigate diversity and inclusion, both from a legal perspective as well as from a societal obligation perspective. So I anticipate we will have quite a few questions today, so I do want to leave time at the end for questions, but let's dive into the material and then I will save time at the end for the Q&A. All right, so today we're going to be talking about exactly what is diversity versus what is inclusion and why we typically see them together. What is the Title VII protected classes and how does that tie into diversity and inclusion? We're going to talk about the 2020 Supreme Court case that actually modified the interpretation of Title VII for those of you who maybe didn't hear about it when it was in the news last year around this time, or just kind of want some more interpretation of it. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk about employers' obligations to diversity and inclusion, both from a legal standpoint as well as from like a societal and an ethical standpoint. We're also going to give you a couple tips and tricks on ways that you can promote a diverse and inclusive work environment. And then I will end with a Q&A session. So please feel free to ask questions, whether it's content questions or if you have very specific questions for maybe instances that you had happen in your workplace or you want kind of guidance. I do want to be able to open the forum to that. If it's super specific, I may not be able to answer it. I may have to reach out to you after the webinar, but asking any questions or providing anything that you've encountered is really great information for everyone here, just because diversity and inclusion isn't really a topic that is, it's not something like a law where you can interpret it and it's very clear cut. Diversity and inclusion has a lot of interpretations. A lot of companies represent their diversity and inclusion differently. So like I said, I want to leave plenty of time for the Q&A, just so if anybody wants guidance or clarification that they can pose those questions at that time. All right, so let's start by talking about what is diversity versus what is inclusion. So diversity is the range of human differences all gathered in one organization. So the word diversity, when we see it from an HR standpoint, is we're really just talking about all the differences that make up our employee population. Inclusion, on the other hand, is when all people, regardless of their differences, are accepted, welcomed, and appreciated as valuable members of a company. So now we're talking about our employee population in terms of how do we engage them? How do we help them feel included? Do they feel safe in the work environment? Do they feel like they can be themselves? That's really what the inclusion portion is about. And really the best way that I have ever seen the concept of diversity and inclusion illustrated and explained in a very simplistic manner is this. Diversity is getting invited to a party, inclusion is getting asked to dance. So using this analogy, diversity is having that diverse representation in your company. So if you don't have a diverse representation and you do want to focus on, maybe being more diverse, starting with that step would be a great first step at looking at, okay, what representation do I have in my company and what am I missing? Are we inadvertently leaving out certain classes? And then once you've kind of taken a look at the diversity and the representation within your company, inclusion is inviting them to make decisions, elicit change, and participate. So of your leaders in your company, whether they're formal leaders and they have the title of manager or supervisor, or informal leaders, leader of the events committee, or, leader of the shift, or, manager, warehouse lead, or something like that. Are those leaders as representative and as diverse as your workforce? Because if not, you may have a little bit of a just disjointed hiring, promoting, or firing practices within your organization that may be causing you to not have the level of diversity and inclusion that you would want to see. So when we talk about the differences and when we talk about diversity, typically we are referring to specific things that create diversity. And the main things that create diversity, at least from an HR and from a legal standpoint, are found under the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is also called Title VII. And this act really outlines the protected classes through which we define diversity, because these are the protected classes specifically for things like discrimination, harassment. A lot of the training that we do focuses on Title VII. And so this is really what creates the diversity that we're talking about from an HR standpoint. So these protected classes under the Federal Civil Rights Act are race and color. And this can include their hair texture and style, national origin, their religion, their age, if they are 40 and above, a disability, whether it be mental or physical, sex and gender, military or veteran status, and citizenship. So these are the main protected classes that really kind of make up our general understanding of diversity and inclusion in the workplace from an HR standpoint. Also, one good thing to keep in mind is that many states, if not all of them, have additional protected classes outside of this list, so you should definitely familiarize yourself with those as well. These should also be included in your employee handbook. So I know when I review a lot of employee handbooks, the EEO statement that we have in there as far as the protected classes, a lot of employers only include the federally protected classes. I highly recommend that you go back and edit your handbook and include any state protected classes as well, just because it does help protect the organization for notifying employees of their rights and protections under state legislation as well as federal. And we're actually going to do an entire series on important handbook policies in July, so definitely register for that one, because we will talk about specific things that should be in the handbook pertaining to diversity and inclusion for your organization. So July is going to be a really good month for those of you who might be looking over your handbook this summer. All right, so now Title VII, like I said, is kind of that list of protected classes. But Title VII, because of the nature of the law, it's always up for interpretation. And the people that interpret Title VII and kind of relay that to employers in terms of what Title VII means in the current world that we are in, it's really interpreted by the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court cases. Not only state and circuit courts make decisions in terms of what precedents are being set for laws, but the Supreme Court is really, the court of courts. They are the highest power in terms of interpreting these laws. So it's very important for employers to at least kind of keep an ear to the ground and pay some attention to the cases that are being decided, because it's really going to give you some good guidance as to how these laws are being interpreted for everyday practice. So for example, last year in June of 2020, the case of Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, issued a ruling that redefined the category of sex under Title VII. So the Supreme Court held in that decision that Title VII does in fact prohibit discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and this includes transgender status. So that was something that had never been interpreted by Title VII or any federal law before. And so based on the case and the things that were going on between Bostock and Clayton County, the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that yes, we are going to include sexual orientation and gender identity as well as transgender status in the interpretation of sex, which is technically a protected class. So basically what this means for employers is that the category of sex under Title VII expanded to really formally include the LGBTQ community as a result of this ruling. So that's something that, like I said, was never really a federal law before. Certain state laws had these protections. California's had a protection for both sexual orientation and gender identity for quite some time. But this was really a redefining moment in terms of Title VII, as well as diversity and inclusion protections in the workplace. So now employers do have a legal obligation to protect the wider scope of Title VII as the Supreme Court opens up these interpretations. Now, as employers, it's also very important to know that you have legal obligations to employees in the realm of diversity and inclusion. And some are legal obligations, and other are starting to be more societal obligations where really there's no law backing it, but employers are starting to feel the pressures of society to start making these changes even before the laws start reflecting the changes that society wants to see. So the first is a legal obligation, and the first legal obligation that you do have to your employees is you have to provide employees with a safe work environment free from discrimination, harassment, and intimidation. And this is primarily governed, like I said, by that Title VII that gives us those protected classes of peoples that you will have to provide the safe work environment so they are not discriminated, harassed, or intimidated in any form. Now, the second legal obligation is to ensure that all of your hiring, firing, and promotion practices are free from any form of discrimination. And this is primarily governed by the EEOC, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. This one tends to be an area that you don't really understand, you don't really see that there's a problem until it's too late, unless you're actively looking for the problem. A lot of people just assume because you're not making decisions based on race or gender or any of the protected classes that you don't fall into this category. Well, there are actually a lot of ways that employers may be inadvertently discriminating against certain genders or protected classes of race, national origin, religion, and things of the like, without even realize that they're doing it. So this is another reason diversity and inclusion is so important, to really take a look at your employee base and say, okay, are we a diverse environment? If not, why aren't we a diverse environment? Let's take a look at what are we doing? How are we hiring? Could some of our our job descriptions or job postings be inadvertently causing people to not apply? So those are kind of the things that tie into diversity and inclusion initiatives in your organization, is really making sure that you have that diversity in your organization and that there is representation, and you are equal across the board in terms of who you're hiring, who you're promoting, and who you're firing. And finally, like I said, employers are not necessarily legally obligated, but they should be working toward including diversity and inclusion initiatives in their daily operations, or business decisions. And this is really not like I said, it's not legally founded, but it is becoming a societal obligation. Customers, clients, other businesses are really paying attention to the ethical patterns of businesses. They're paying attention to, where they stand on certain issues. We're starting to see businesses get really involved in social issues, especially when it comes to equality, diversity, inclusion, and pay equity, which is another big thing happening right now. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But this is something, like I said, it's not legally grounded, but it is something you may want to consider, because there is a very, very good chance that as legislation continues to pass, especially with the current presidential administration that we have now, I think we are going to see a lot more of instances like that Supreme Court case last year, where we are going to see a lot more federal laws start to mirror what's happening from societal demands. So here are a few ways that you can promote a diverse and inclusive work environment. And these are just kind of some basic first steps that you can take. They don't cost a ton of money, which is always really nice. But the first step is going to be to promote pay equity and engage in pay equity audits at least once every 2 years. We're actually seeing a lot of states pass laws requiring employers to engage in pay equity audits, just to make sure that they are paying their employees equitably. States like California, I believe, and New York have already passed them, and they are requiring employers to do pay equity audits. I believe it's every 2 years. I'm not sure off the top of my head if it's annually or every 2 years. And they are going to have to start reporting those pay equity reports as part of their EEO-1 reports if they have 50 or more employees. So that is something that you will need to keep in mind if you end up working in one of those states that eventually pass one of these laws, is you will have to start doing these audits and possibly reporting them as a part of your EEO-1 report. Also, you can provide everyone in your company with harassment prevention training, which really encourages respect and ally behaviors. Harassment prevention training is really something that we saw a lot of states start passing laws on about, I want to say 5-6 years ago, with the height of the Me Too movement in 2015. And we've seen a little bit of a slowdown since then. Illinois was actually the last state to join the requirement of harassment training on an annual basis for all employees and all employers. We're not really seeing as many states put that on the docket when we're going into voting time. So that's not something we're seeing a lot of trending of. But eventually we are anticipating that a lot more states are probably going to pass these types of laws, because a lot of states have already, based on court cases in those states, they have already kind of set the precedent that employers that have harassment prevention training in place fare better when they are hit with any type of harassment or discrimination claims, whether those claims are through the EEOC or through a private lawsuit. So we recommend to all of our clients, if you have the budget for training, even if it's just once upon onboarding, I highly, highly recommend enrolling your employees in a harassment prevention training. You get a certificate of a completion if you do it with us. If they're not able to make it for whatever reason, they get sick, we allow you to reschedule up to 2 times without paying any extra fees. So, we try to anticipate for employees not always taking training as seriously as they should. But this is something we recommend to all of our clients because it does add an extra layer of protection if you are ever hit with a harassment or a discrimination claim. Also, another tip that we have is facilitating ongoing feedback from your employees and having an open door policy. So a lot of employers have open door policies in their handbook, but a lot of employers don't really execute the open door policies the way that they're supposed to. So realistically, an open door policy doesn't mean, metaphorically, that all of your managers' doors are open to talk about whatever you want. What it means to have an open door policy is that not only are your managers available to talk to people, but your managers are encouraging these conversations. So the managers should be starting conversations with employees like, hey, how are things going? Or, hey, I noticed, you and so don't really talk a lot. Or, I noticed that these people kind of are in their own clique. What's going on with that? Maybe, let's start putting them in assigning them to teams and getting them to, cross collaborate. So managers are really supposed to, as a part of the open door policy, they're really supposed to be engaging with their employees in these conversations to help the employer prevent instances of things like harassment and discrimination and any instances like that we obviously don't want to happen. And having an open door policy and having the ability to allow employees an avenue to communicate with someone in upper management helps to alleviate these types of issues from happening. So another thing that you can do as far as an open door policy is there are options to have third-party companies that they basically host like for lack of better terms, a 1-800 hotline. But it's a hotline where a third party takes the report and then you get a transcript of the report. So if the employee does not feel comfortable going to any member of management, they can actually call a third party company and they file their complaint. They can do so anonymously, and then you, the employer, gets a copy of the complaint. What this does is it allows employees to feel more comfortable being honest with different things that are happening, and it gives you a better pulse on your business in terms of what is going on. A lot of people think that these types of hotlines should only be used for large businesses. I completely 100% disagree. I think smaller businesses actually run a bigger risk of not having a real honest pulse on their business, because when you have a smaller company, you typically have less managers. A lot of those managers are probably tenured. They're probably really good friends. A lot of them may have been around since the company was first founded, and that's going to be very intimidating to employees who are on the front line and don't necessarily want to go to a member of management and quote unquote make waves. So having an open door policy and even a hotline as a small employer can really help you make sure that you are stopping any type of harassment or discriminating behaviors before they even start. Another way to promote a diverse and inclusive environment is acknowledging holidays and awareness months for those who represent your workforce. So things like Juneteenth and Pride Month, Mental Health Awareness Month, Kwanzaa and Hanukkah can be important to some of your employees. Not everybody celebrates Christmas. So it's kind of something that some employers never had to think of before, but it is something that we need to start thinking about. Even if we don't, do a Hanukkah and a Kwanzaa party the same as you would do a Christmas party, just acknowledging that these holidays exist and that they're important to some of your employees can really make a difference, because they may feel left out, or they may even feel forced to celebrate Christmas, which is a holiday that they don't necessarily believe in. So things like, these types of holidays or these types of awareness months like Pride Month, where allies really get to bring awareness to the issues in the LGBTQ community, are really, really important months. And if you have representation from these groups in your employee pool, it can be very, very bad for morale and productivity and overall, team chemistry if you're completely ignoring a large part of what other employees celebrate that may not be as mainstream. So that's something to definitely keep an eye on. And just acknowledging these types of months or holidays and events can be very, very inexpensive, but it can do a lot of good. And finally, our last tip is to mix up your teams during team events, meetings, or collaborations to encourage diverse thinking and inclusivity. Studies actually show us that people from diverse backgrounds, when they are put into any type of collaboration or brainstorming group, actually come up with better ideas faster, and they solve problems quicker and more efficiently. So it's really good to mix up your teams when you're doing any type of brainstorming or cross collaboration or anything like that. So your teams can really get to know each other, work with people outside of their immediate clique, and just really benefit from the diverse standpoints and experiences and thought processes of other people on the teams. A lot of the times you have departments that never interact, or you have employees that never interact, and they could actually really benefit by knowing what other people in the company do when solving any type of procedural problems or process problems or just inter-office communication problems. So if you're looking to solve a problem in your team and you're just not getting anywhere, I highly recommend doing a cross-collaborative group of different people in your organization. And you'd be surprised at what kind of solutions they come up with and how efficient and good they actually are. So definitely that's a really, really good tip to use to promote a diverse and inclusive environment in your company. All right. So I know that was quite a bit of information, and I wanted to provide you guys with, enough information to get you thinking and give you some really good tips. But I also wanted to leave enough time for some Q&A in case we had a couple questions, which I see that we do. But if you haven't asked your question already, please feel free to type into the question box now. Just as a reminder, before I jump into the questions, this presentation was recorded and it will be available to watch again. To do that, just as a reminder, you can visit www.payentry.com and hover your mouse over the webinars tab at the top and click on webinar recordings. All of our recordings are hosted on that page, and they're usually up within 24 hours of the original webinar. So that is a very good resource for you if you missed any, or if you just want to rewatch any of the webinars. There's also going to be a survey that follows this webinar, so feel free to leave your feedback. Also, if you have any suggestions on topics or things you'd like us to talk about this year, please feel free to include that in your feedback, because we love getting ideas from our audience in terms of what topics they want us to talk about. Like I said, diversity inclusion actually came from you guys. We had quite a few requests to talk about it, especially with things like Pride Month coming up. A lot of people just kind of wanted to know, what they needed to do and what they could do and things like that. So we were really happy to get that suggestion and be able to talk about this topic today. All right, so let's see what questions we have. All right, is diversity and inclusion just another term for affirmative action or equal employment opportunity? Okay, that is a great question. And this is often a common misconception, but no, diversity and inclusion are not the same as affirmative action or equal employment opportunity. They are different. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, affirmative action is more of a legally driven mandate. And it's primarily for government contractors. And what they have to do is they have to take positive steps to ensure recruitment and advancement of the protected classes. So that is something primarily just for government contractors, but it's not the same as diversity and inclusion. And then on the other hand, equal employment opportunity, which you were talking about, that is that section in your handbook that lists the protected classes and refers to Title VII. That's really just an employment practice law, and that's really there to ensure non-discrimination, fairness, and equity in the workplace. So they're a little bit different than diversity and inclusion. EEO definitely ties into diversity and inclusion versus affirmative action is definitely different. So it's a great question. All right, next question. If someone asked you why they should be concerned with diversity in the workforce, what would you say to them? All right, that is a really great question. I think I would say that understanding and valuing people from different backgrounds is a huge pillar to an organization's success. Just having different backgrounds and experiences, like I said before, has shown to completely revamp what we consider to be a cross-collaborative and a successful group. So diversity really fosters more creative and inclusive environments where people can be valued. I know from my personal experience, I grew up in a family where, my mom was a stay-at-home mom and my older sister got pregnant in high school, married her high school sweetheart, and she became a stay-at-home mom. So early on, I had a bunch of women in my life that their goal was to be moms, and it was weird for them because I wanted a career and they didn't know how to help me with that because they had never been career women. But I wanted to use my gifts out in the workforce. I didn't want to be a stay-at-home mom. And as a woman, it was really important to me to forge my own path. And, less than 100 years ago, that was a non-existent reality. Women didn't have jobs. They didn't have a lot of things. They didn't have rights. That was really important to me growing up to be able to see other women, outside of my immediate family who were, having jobs and balancing their home life and their work life. So allowing for diverse ideas in the workforce to exist, it can really bring about great change that sometimes we didn't even know that we needed. And as long as we're willing to care about the voices and really embrace the changes that they're fighting for, they can be really beneficial to our businesses. So I hope that answers your question. Another question we had was, I've heard a lot about equality and equity. You mentioned pay equity audits. What's the difference between pay equality and pay equity? That's another really great question, and I think it's really important for people to understand the difference between pay equality and pay equity. Like I said, especially because a lot of states are really harping on these pay equity audits that they are mandating starting either this year or next year, depending on what state you're in. So I've seen a lot about the equality versus equity conversations. I know there's quite a few posts on social media of equality versus equity just because of a lot of the social issues that are going on right now. But the way to really understand the difference, at least from an HR standpoint, is equality is about sameness or uniformity. So for example, if you have someone come in and work as a cashier at your establishment, then you're going to start all your cashiers at $12 an hour. That's equality. Everyone gets the exact same, they're uniform, they're equal. Equity, on the other hand, assured conditions for optimal success and opportunity for everyone in the workforce. So essentially, it's ensuring that no one has an unfair advantage over another person. So for example, let's say you have two cashiers that both started at $12 per hour, and after the first year, you give a $1 per hour raise to the male cashier, but not the female cashier. The female cashier, but not the male cashier. That would be, for example, an unequitable pay practice unless you had a business decision for it. So for example, you would have to justify the raise. And this is what, when you're doing the pay equity analysis or audits, this is what you're looking for. Why did someone get a raise? Why did we start someone higher than someone else? And is it because of a business reason, or are we possibly discriminating against someone in some protected class? So for the example that I said, where we gave the male a $1 an hour raise over the female after the first year, that would be unequitable pay practices. Now, let's say, for example, that the male after the first year, he received a degree, and that's why we gave him the $1 an hour raise. Well, that might be a good business reason for some people, but something you have to be careful of is that unless that degree is related to his skills and abilities as a cashier, that's not considered a justifiable reason to give someone a raise. Education does not always justify a raise, and that can actually still be seen as an unequitable pay practice. However, this time it wouldn't be due to gender like maybe it originally looked like. Now it's actually going to be due to the availability of resources, because some minority groups don't have the same access to education as other groups. So education, again, doesn't automatically trigger, oh, that's a great reason for a raise. So it's really important to do these audits and ask those types of questions as to whether or not you're being equitable in your pay practices, in terms of paying everyone fairly for what they bring to the table based on, what their experience is, what their education, their applicable education is, how long they've been with the company, their knowledge of the job, things like that, things that should go into the pay practices and not these outliers that sometimes get factored into why we pay people what we pay people. I got another question here. I had an employee complain to me that they were experiencing microaggressions from another employee. What is a microaggression, and does it fall under harassment or discrimination? Okay, I'm really glad you asked this question, because sometimes employees may come to you with their experiences or something that happens to them in the workplace. And if you don't fully understand what they're talking about, that's okay. But I always encourage you to ask. And as payroll clients, remember that you can always reach out to Kathy or myself if something like, if something like this happens and you need any type of guidance or you need clarification on exactly kind of what the employee might be talking about. So just to give you kind of a little bit of an explanation, a microaggression is kind of a verbal or a nonverbal insult or aggressive behavior, but it's very minor and it's very passive. So it could be intentional or unintentional, but it's usually pretty subtle. And these behaviors are usually hostile or derogatory towards a person, based on either their race, religion, skin color, or gender. Those are kind of the top four microaggressions that we see, but it could be for any of the protected characteristics, but usually it's due to race, religion, skin color, or gender. Now, these types of behaviors would definitely fall under the harassment and discrimination category, like we talked about earlier, because the behaviors are due to protected characteristics. That's really what classifies as harassment and discrimination in terms of Title VII and in the HR realm. So if you have an employee that is experiencing these types of things, I would definitely treat that as a harassment complaint, and let them know that you need to look into it and do an investigation, talk to that employee and things like that, because that would definitely fall under harassment and discrimination. All right, so it looks like that's all the questions that I have right now, but great questions, guys. I really, really appreciate them. So thank you for your time today. Just as a quick reminder, next week, Kathy is going to be talking about benefit plan compliance and the fact that it's not your insurance company's job. You are still responsible for your benefit plan compliance. So she's going to go over kind of what that entails and some good tips and tricks. So if you have not done so already, go onto our website and register for that webinar. We also have all the webinars from now all the way through July posted on our website, including that handbook session that I talked about. It's going to be 3 weeks worth of webinars back to back, and we are going to cover all the important parts of a handbook, why certain things need to be in there, what your obligations are from a handbook, because we've gotten a lot of employee handbook questions. So that's going to be a really great series. So check our website out, register for some of those webinars, and yeah, we look forward to seeing you guys at the next webinar. Have a great weekend.